The security cameras in the West Wing were looped to a 30-second delay, a digital glitch Hung Min had engineered himself. Usually, this trick was reserved for slipping assassins past the perimeter, but tonight, the most dangerous man in Seoul was using it to haunt his own hallways. It was a bitter irony that Hung Min could command 1,000 soldiers with a single text, yet he was forced to hold his breath like a common thief just to see what was happening behind the nursery door. For 72 hours, Advisor Park's words had been a slow-acting poison in Hung Min's ear. Park, a man who had survived 3 transitions of power, had pointed to the eerie quiet of the children's wing. The maid, Chi-Chi, has silenced them, boss. Even traumatized children cry. If they are silent, it is because she has broken them or sedated them. To a man who equated silence with the grave, those words were a declaration of war. In Hung Min's world, suspicion was a verdict. He didn't believe in HR disputes or second chances. He had instructed his personal guard that if the glitch in the kid's behavior was what Park suspected, Chi-Chi wouldn't just be fired, she would vanish into the Incheon harbor before the sun touched the horizon. To Hung Min, protecting Sejun and Ha-yoon wasn't fatherhood, it was asset management. The estate had become a tomb of marble and glass since the betrayal that left Hung Min alone. He moved through the halls feeling the weight of his gold watch and the ink on his neck, symbols of a power that couldn't buy a single word from his non-verbal daughter, Ha-yoon. His heart was a fortress, and he had hired Chi-Chi only because her references were as spotless as her simple uniform. He wanted a ghost to raise his children, not a person. As he pressed his ear against the heavy oak door of the playroom, Hung Min's jaw was tense, his hand resting on the cold metal of the handle. He expected to hear the chemical haze of sedation or the whimpering of fearful toddlers. Instead, a sound shattered the order of his home, a rhythmic, chaotic beat of African drums and the high-pitched, breathless shrieks of his children's laughter. It was a glitch in the reality he had built, a sound so vibrant it felt like a physical assault on his grief. The office was a shrine of cold, calculated efficiency, smelling of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of old secrets. Hung Min sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, his muscular frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light of the morning sun. Across from him stood Advisor Park, a man whose spine was permanently curved from decades of bowing, yet whose eyes possessed the predatory sharpness of a vulture waiting for a carcass to cool. "There is a rhythm to this house that has been broken, boss," Park began, his voice a dry rasp that barely rose above a whisper. He didn't look at Hung Min's tattoos, the dragons coiling around his neck, but rather at the silence of the room. For 2 years since the tragedy, Sejun and Ha-yoon have lived in a state of respectful, necessary quiet. It was the silence of grief, yes, but also the silence of discipline, of tradition. Hung Min's jaw tightened. He adjusted his gold watch, the metal catching the light. He hated the silence, but he understood it. It was a language he knew how to speak. "Get to the point, Park. I pay you for insights, not philosophy." Park stepped closer, his movements deliberate. "The new maid, Chi-Chi, she does not understand our ways. At first, I thought it was merely the exuberance of her youth, perhaps the different vibrancy of her background. But it has become something more. A cultural infection, boss. She is introducing a glitch into the foundation of your children's upbringing." Hung Min looked up, his brows furrowing. "A glitch?" "They don't cry when they fall," Park said, leaning in. "And more concerning, they don't remain still when you are gone. I have observed her through the monitors. She brings in music that has no place in a house of mourning. She speaks to Ha-yoon not as a daughter of a great house, but as if she were a common child in a marketplace. She is teaching them to ignore the boundaries you have spent years building." Park paused, letting the silence of the office amplify the weight of his next words. "But it is the quiet that worries me most. When I pass the nursery, I no longer hear the typical sounds of a child's world. It is a hollow, unnatural stillness. A maid from such a different world, she might be using substances to keep them compliant, or perhaps she is scaring them into a silence that only looks like peace. In my experience, when a child becomes a ghost, someone has already taken their soul. Hong Min felt the familiar heat of rage beginning to simmer in his chest. It wasn't the slow burn of a father's worry, it was the explosive pressure of a commander who suspected a breach in his perimeter. His children were the only things in this world he hadn't put a price on. If Chi-Chi was poisoning them with her glitches, or worse, sedating them to make her own job easier, it wouldn't just be an ending for her employment, it would be an ending for her. The security feed has been erratic lately, Hong Min noted, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register. A digital glitch, perhaps, or a deliberate mask. She is clever, boss. She smiles with a warmth that blinds the eyes. But what happens when the cameras are dark? What happens when the master is away? A wolf doesn't howl until the shepherd leaves the field.
Hung Men stood up, the chair scraping against the floor like a blade. He looked at the locked door of his office and then toward the west wing where his children lived. He thought of Hyun's big, silent eyes and the way Se-yoon stared at the floor. He had trusted Chi-Chi because she was the first person in years who didn't flinch when she looked at his tattoos. But if Park was right, if she was a virus disguised as a cure, he would have to excise her himself. "Tell the driver to prepare the car for the airport," Hung Min commanded, his eyes locking onto Park's with a lethal intensity. "Announce to the staff that I will be in Seoul for 3 days, no exceptions." "And if I am right, boss?" Park asked, a faint serpentine smile touching his lips. "Then there will be no trial," Hung Min replied, his voice as cold as the obsidian on his desk. "Only a cleaning." The heavy iron-wrought gates of the estate had barely finished clanging shut behind Hung Min's departing Maserati before he was slipping through the servants' entrance at the rear of the property. He had traded his tailored suit jacket for a dark tactical windbreaker, though the gold watch on his wrist still glinted like a predator's eye in the low light of the service corridor. He moved with a silence that was practiced and terrifying, bypassing the motion sensors he had programmed himself. In his mind, he was already mourning the woman he was about to catch. He was certain he would find his children slumped in a drug-induced lethargy or huddled in a corner, silenced by the shadow of a raised hand. As he climbed the back stairs toward the west wing, the air changed. Usually, this part of the mansion felt like a sterile museum, cold, smelling of lemon wax and the oppressive weight of correct behavior. But today, a low, vibrating hum began to thrum through the floorboards. It was a rhythmic, driving beat of a djembe drum, punctuated by a sound so alien to Hung Min's ears that he instinctively reached for the concealed holster at his small of the back. It was the sound of a high-pitched, breathless shriek. He reached the nursery door and found it slightly ajar, the first security glitch of the afternoon. Hung Min pressed his face to the narrow crack, his jaw locking so tight the muscles in his neck pulsed over his tattoos. The room was unrecognizable. The hand-carved mahogany chairs had been overturned to create a jagged tunnel draped with vibrant, patterned fabrics, pinks, ochres, and deep indigos that Chi-Chi must have brought from her own world. In the center of the chaos stood Chi-Chi. She wasn't the invisible bowing servant he had hired. Her hair was loose, and she was moving with a fluid, electric energy, tapping out a frantic rhythm on an empty plastic water jug.
"And now, the glitch!" she cried out, her voice a melodious contrast to the grim silence Park had promised. She suddenly stopped the music and made a distorted, hilarious face, freezing in a ridiculous pose. Sejun, who usually sat as still as a statue under his father's gaze, let out a jagged explosion of laughter and lunged forward to poke her arm to unfreeze the glitch. But it was Hyun who held Hong Min's breath hostage. His non-verbal daughter was on her hands and knees, her face flushed a healthy, vibrant red. She wasn't quiet. She was making soft, rhythmic chirping sounds, imitating the drum beat, her small hands slapping the carpet in perfect time with Chi-Chi's glitches. Hong Min watched, paralyzed. Chi-Chi began a game of the broken robot, moving in jagged, stuttering steps that sent both children into paroxysms of delight. She wasn't drugging them. She was waking them up. She was taking the trauma that had frozen their tongues and turning it into a game where being broken was the funniest thing in the world. For a moment, the crime boss forgot his rage. He saw Hai-Yun reach out and grab the hem of Chi-Chi's simple dress, her eyes sparkling with a light he hadn't seen since the funeral. Chi-Chi knelt, pulling both children into a messy, unscripted hug, whispering stories about a sun that never set and a music that lived inside your bones. Hong Min's hand trembled on the doorframe. This was the cultural infection Park had warned him about, the infection of joy, the glitch of spontaneity in a house built on rigid, fearful steel. He saw his daughter's lips move, struggling to shape a sound, encouraged by Chi-Chi's patient, wide smile. The sight should have brought him to his knees in relief, but the shadow of Park's whispers still lingered like a stain. His mind, trained for betrayal, struggled to compute this version of reality. He stood in the dark hallway, a ghost in his own home, watching a woman give his children the one thing his millions never could, a reason to make noise. The heavy oak door didn't just open, it splintered against the floral-patterned wallpaper as Hong Min stepped from the shadows. The transition was instantaneous and violent, a shift from the silent observer to the explosive warlord. The air in the room, which a second ago had been thick with the warmth of laughter and African drums, turned ice cold. Hong Min stood in the frame, his muscular chest heaving beneath his tactical jacket, his jaw set in a line so rigid it looked carved from granite. Chi-Chi gasped, her body instinctively shielding the children as she scrambled to her feet. The plastic water jug she had been using as a drum clattered across the floor, the hollow sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden, suffocating silence. Sejun shrank back into the fabric tunnel they had built, his eyes wide with a terror that hadn't been there moments ago. But it was Hai-Yun's reaction that fueled the fire in Hong Min's veins. His daughter, who had just been chirping and reaching for joy, went instantly limp, her face draining of color as she retreated into the hollow shell of her former self. To Hong Min, this wasn't a retreat from fear, it was evidence of a crime. He saw the overturned furniture and the glitches not as a breakthrough, but as the desecration of his sanctuary. He stepped forward, shedding his dark jacket to reveal the tailored white shirt beneath, the silk straining against his shoulders. The dragons on his neck seemed to writhe in the dim light, and the gold watch on his wrist, a symbol of the rigid, unforgiving schedule he demanded, mocked the chaotic joy he had just witnessed. "What is this?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating growl that felt like a physical weight in the room. He didn't wait for an answer. He kicked aside a pile of colorful cushions Chi-Chi had brought, his leather shoes leaving scuff marks on the pristine carpet. "I hire you to provide stability, to maintain the dignity of this house, and I find you playing in the dirt, indulging in this noise?" "Mr. Hong Min, please," Chi-Chi stammered, her voice trembling but her gaze holding his. "They were laughing. Hai-Yun was making sounds. She was trying to speak." "Silence!" he roared, the word echoing off the marble hallways outside. He loomed over her, a titan of order standing amidst the ruins of their play. "You have infected them with your chaos. You have turned my daughter into a spectacle and my son into a coward who hides in tunnels. I saw the way they looked at you. You aren't teaching them. You are seducing them away from the discipline they need to survive this world." He looked down at his tattooed hands, the hands that had built an empire out of blood and iron, and felt a surge of blind, protective pride. He believed he was the architect of their safety, and Chi-Chi was a wrecking ball. He couldn't see the miracle because it didn't fit into the narrow, dark boxes he used to categorize life. "You are a glitch in this house, Chi-Chi," he hissed, his eyes locked onto hers with a lethal intensity. "A mistake I am correcting right now. Get out. Don't pack your things. Don't look at my children. If you are still on my property in 10 minutes, I will let Advisor Park handle your departure, and you know exactly what that means." Chi-Chi reached out a hand, perhaps to touch his arm or to point to the children, but the coldness in his expression was a wall she couldn't breach. She looked at Seo-jun and Ha-yoon one last time, her eyes filling with a heartbreaking sorrow, before she bowed her head and hurried past him. Hong-min stood alone in the center of the room, his breath jagged. He looked at the overturned mahogany chairs and the scattered African fabrics. With a grunt of effort, he began righting the furniture, forcing the order back into the room with brutal, shaking hands. He expected the silence to feel like victory. Instead, as he looked at his children huddled in the corner, it felt like he was standing in a graveyard he had dug himself. The heavy iron gates of the estate groaned shut with a finality that echoed through the valley, severing the last thread of warmth from the mansion. From his second-story balcony, Hong-min watched the small, solitary figure of Chi-Chi disappear down the winding driveway. She carried nothing but her dignity and the small cloth bag she had arrived with, her head bowed as she wiped a hand across her face. He waited for the surge of triumph, for the satisfaction of a commander who had successfully purged an infiltrator from his ranks, but all he felt was the biting chill of the evening air. Inside, the house had been restored to what Advisor Park called perfect order. The colorful drapes had been stripped from the nursery walls and burned in the incinerator. The overturned mahogany chairs were back in their precise, unmoving positions, polished to a mirror shine that reflected only the cold light of the chandeliers. The djembe drum rhythm was gone, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, a sound that marked the passing of seconds like a hammer hitting a nail. Hong-min walked through the west wing, his leather soles clicking sharply against the marble. He stopped at the nursery door and peered in. Se-yoon and Ha-yoon sat on the rug, surrounded by the expensive, educational wooden toys he had bought them. They weren't playing. They sat with their backs straight and their hands in their laps, staring at the wall with the vacant, wide-eyed look of soldiers in a trench. When Hong-min entered, they didn't run to him. They didn't even flinch. They simply adjusted their posture, their small bodies stiffening into the mold of the perfect children he thought he wanted. "It is much better now, sir." Park's voice drifted from the doorway, as smooth and cold as a serpent sliding over stone. The advisor stood with his hands tucked into his sleeves, a look of profound serenity on his weathered face. "The air is clear again. No more noise, no more glitches. They are learning the value of silence once more. It is the only way they will grow strong enough to carry your name." Hong-min looked at Ha-yoon. Her lips, which had been shaping sounds and chirping just hours ago, were pressed into a thin, white line. She looked smaller than she had this morning, as if the joy Chi-Chi breathed into her was a gas that kept her upright, and now that it was gone, she was slowly collapsing inward. He reached out a hand to touch her hair, but his fingers, covered in the tattoos of his violent trade, felt too heavy, too clumsy. As he drew near, Ha-yoon didn't pull away. She simply ceased to be there, her eyes glazing over into a 1,000-yard stare that looked right through him. The silence of the mansion wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. It was the silence of a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room until Hong-min's own lungs felt tight. He retreated to his office and poured a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid trembling slightly in the crystal. He looked at the security monitors on his desk. The glitch in the loop had been fixed. The cameras now showed every corner of the house in high-definition, clinical clarity. He could see his children sitting in their silent room. He could see the empty hallways. He could see everything, yet he felt as though he were staring into a void. He had won the war for order, but as he sat in the dark, the gold watch on his wrist ticking in time with his racing heart, Hong Men realized that he hadn't saved his children. He had simply built a more beautiful cage. The house was no longer a home. It was a tomb of marble and silk, and he was the ghost haunting its halls, beginning to realize that the noise he had hated was the only thing that had been keeping them all alive. The following morning, the sun bled a pale, sickly yellow through the sheer curtains of the nursery, but the light brought no warmth to the room. Hong Min sat in a velvet armchair in the corner, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the black ink of the dragons that seemed to pulse with his mounting anxiety. He had been watching them for hours. Seijun was methodically lining up wooden blocks in a perfect straight line, his face a mask of joyless obedience. But it was Ha-Yun who worried him. She hadn't touched her food. She sat on the edge of her bed, her small hands gripped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white, her eyes fixed on the door with a desperate, haunting intensity. "Eat, Ha-Yun," Hong Min said, his voice softer than usual, lacking its sharp edge of command. He pushed a plate of sliced fruit toward her. "It's your favorite." Ha-Yun didn't look at the fruit. She didn't look at him. She simply shook her head, a slow, rhythmic movement of refusal. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like it was drowning them. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall felt like a gavel strike against Hong Min's heart. He realized then that he was a stranger in this room. He knew how to secure their perimeter, how to vet their teachers, and how to fund their futures, but he didn't know how to reach through the glass wall of her silence. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sound so sharp it made Hong Min flinch. Seijun had accidentally knocked over his line of blocks. Instead of laughing, as he had yesterday with Chi-Chi, the boy's face crumpled into a look of absolute terror. He scrambled to gather the blocks, his breath coming in jagged, panicked hitches, looking at his father as if expecting a blow. Hong Min stood up, his heart aching. "It's okay, Seijun, it's just blocks." But the damage was done. The order Hong Min had enforced was a weight his children couldn't carry. It was then that Ha-Yun did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She stood up. Her small frame was trembling, her chest heaving as if she were fighting for air. She looked at the door, then turned her gaze to her father. Her eyes, usually as vacant as a winter sky, were suddenly burning with a fierce, unmistakable rage. She opened her mouth. Hong Min froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He waited for the word he had dreamed of. Appa. He waited for her to call for him, to bridge the gap he had spent thousands of dollars on therapists to close. Stay, she whispered. It was a broken, croaking sound, the vocal cords rusty from disuse, but the word was as clear as a bell in the quiet room. Hong Min felt the world tilt. "Ha-Yun? You spoke!" She stepped toward him, her tiny hands balled into fists at her sides. Stay! She shouted this time, the sound ripping through the sterile air of the mansion. "Chi-Chi, bring back!" The force of her voice sent a shockwave through Hong Min. She wasn't crying, she was demanding. She was fighting for the only person who had looked past the silence and seen the girl inside. She wasn't calling for the king of the house. She was calling for the glitch he had discarded. Seijun dropped the blocks and ran to his sister, grabbing her hand, his own voice joining hers in a wordless, sobbing plea. Hong Men stood paralyzed in the center of the nursery. The dragons on his skin felt like lead. He had wanted her to speak, had prayed for a miracle, and now that it had happened, it felt like a condemnation. His daughter had found her voice only to tell him that he was the one who was wrong. She hadn't spoken out of love for him. She had spoken out of the sheer, desperate need for the love he had thrown out of his gates. As her screams for "Re" echoed off the marble walls, Hong Min realized that the order he had fought so hard to restore was nothing more than a slow-motion execution of his children's spirits. He had won the war, but he was losing his daughter all over again. Hong Min stood in the center of the nursery, the echoes of his daughter's screams still vibrating in the sterile air. He had ushered the children to the dining hall with a panicked, clumsy promise of sweets they didn't want, needing a moment of silence to breathe. But the silence now felt like an indictment. His eyes fell on the small, unassuming nightstand near the rocking chair where Chi-Chi used to sit. Tucked beneath a stack of rigid, approved parenting manuals was a worn, leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed and its cover stained with what looked like a drop of spilled tea. His instinct, honed by a decade of counterintelligence and paranoia, was to suspect a ledger. Advisor Park had hinted at cultural infections and hidden agendas, and in Hong Min's world, a hidden notebook was usually a record of vulnerabilities or a spy's log of movement. He picked it up, his tattooed thumb tracing the spine. He expected to find a list of his associates or a schedule of his security rotations. Instead, when he flicked the cover open, he was met with a burst of color that made him blink. The first page wasn't a log of times or dates. It was a sprawling, hand-drawn map of the galaxy of Haiyun. In the center of the page was a large, bright yellow sun, and around it, Chi-Chi had written in careful, flowing script, "Favorite color, marigold. Not just yellow. It has to be the deep orange yellow of the sun before it sleeps." Hong Min sank into the rocking chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He began to flip the pages, his heart beginning a slow, painful thud against his ribs. This wasn't a spy's journal. It was a love letter to a girl he realized he barely knew. Page after page was filled with meticulous observations that his high-priced doctors had missed. Tuesday. Haiyun didn't speak, but she hummed a C-sharp today while looking at the blue jays. She likes the vibration of the sound more than the sound itself. I will call this the hummingbird glitch. Further in, he found sketches of his daughter's hands, drawn with a tenderness that made his throat tighten. "Sejun is afraid of the dark, but not because of the shadows," one entry read. "He's afraid because the dark is where the rules disappear. He needs a nightlight that isn't white. White is the color of hospitals. He needs a glitch light, deep purple, like a grape." Hong Min's vision blurred as he reached the final entries. There were no notes on his business, no mentions of his wealth, and no record of his crimes. Instead, there was a list of words we are waiting for. The first word on the list was Appa. Below it, Chi-Chi had written, "He is a mountain of a man who has forgotten how to climb. We must show him the trail." A single folded piece of paper fell from the back of the notebook. It was a drawing of a man in a black suit. The figure was tall and imposing, covered in intricate dragon tattoos, but in the drawing, the man wasn't holding a gun or a phone. He was holding two small hands, and he was smiling. At the bottom, in Haiyun's shaky, uncertain scrawl, was a single letter R next to a heart. The notebook felt heavier than a brick in his hands. He looked at his gold watch, the symbol of the rigid, correct time he had used to fire the only person who had actually looked at his children. He had searched for a betrayal of his empire, but all he had found was a betrayal of his own heart. Chi-Chi hadn't been an infection. She had been the only one trying to bridge the gap between the mountain and the children living at its base. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Advisor Park had called her a glitch because she was the only thing in the house that wasn't under the advisor's control. She was the only thing that wasn't a lie. Hong Min closed the book, his fingers trembling. He realized that while he was busy guarding the gates against his enemies, he had let the real monster inside his house, and he had sent the only guardian he had away in tears. The paper trail didn't lead to a crime. It led directly back to his own failure as a father. Hung Min's office was flooded with the artificial glow of a dozen monitors, but the light felt cold, stripping away the prestige of the obsidian desk and the gold-leafed awards on the walls. He sat with Chi-Chi's notebook still open in his lap, a stark contrast to the thick leather-bound financial reports Advisor Park had provided earlier that month. Suspicion, once a weapon Hung Min used against outsiders, had now turned inward, focusing on the man who had stood at his right hand for a decade. He leaned forward, his tattooed fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed the deep layer encryption of the estate's secondary accounts, the ones Park managed with absolute discretion. For years, Hung Min had trusted the numbers because he trusted the man. But as he cross-referenced the maintenance costs of the nursery with the actual receipts Chi-Chi had tucked into the back of her diary for reimbursement, the glitch finally revealed its true shape. The numbers didn't just fail to align, they screamed of a systematic hollow-out. For every dollar spent on his children's well-being, $3 had vanished into a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. Park hadn't just been skimming, he had been hemorrhaging the estate's wealth, hiding the theft under a mountain of necessary security upgrades and discreet staffing fees. The realization hit Hung Min like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Advisor Park had called her a glitch because she was the only thing in the house that wasn't under the advisor's control. She was the only thing that wasn't a lie. Hung Min closed the book, his fingers trembling. He realized that while he was busy guarding the gates against his enemies, he had let the real monster inside his house, and he had sent the only guardian he had away in tears. The paper trail didn't lead to a crime, it led directly back to his own failure as a father. The office door opened without a knock. Advisor Park stepped in, his face a mask of serene loyalty, carrying a silver tray with a single cup of tea. "The house is quiet, boss. I have already begun the search for a new, more traditional candidate, someone who understands the hierarchy." Hung Min didn't look up from the screen. He felt the heat of his rage transforming from a chaotic fire into a cold, lethal blade. "Tell me, Park," he said, his voice dangerously low, "why does a marigold cost $10,000? The tray in Park's hands didn't rattle, but the air in the room seemed to thin. "I don't follow, sir." Hung Min turned the monitor around. On the screen was the bank transfer to the shell company, time-stamped at the exact hour Park had first whispered the lies about Chi-Chi in his ear. "You called her an infection," Hung Min hissed, standing up slowly, his muscular frame looming over the desk. The dragons on his neck seemed to darken as his blood pressure rose. "You said she was a glitch in the order, but the only glitch in this house is the one who's been stealing from my children's future while I was too busy looking for monsters in the nursery." Park's composure didn't break, but he took a single step back, his eyes darting toward the door. "I did it for the strength of the organization, boss. You were becoming soft, distracted by—" Hung Min's hand shot across the desk, his tattooed fingers closing around Park's throat with the speed of a striking cobra. The silver tray clattered to the floor, the tea spilling like a dark stain across the marble. "You used my grief," Hung Min whispered, his face inches from the man he had once considered a father figure. "You used my children's silence to hide your hand in my pockets. You made me throw away the only person who actually saw them." He didn't call for the guards. He didn't need to. The weight of his own failure as a leader and a father was a heavier sentence than any bullet. He flung Park away from him, the old man collapsing against the obsidian desk. "Get out!" Hung Min commanded, the words vibrating with a primal, bone-deep fury. "If I see your face on this side of the city by dawn, the cleaning I promised Chi-Chi will be yours instead. And Park, leave the keys to the Cayman accounts. You're going to pay back every cent of the joy you stole." As the advisor scrambled out of the room, broken and humiliated, Hung Min sank back into his chair. He looked at the notebook on his lap. He had found the traitor, but the victory was hollow. He had purged the infection, but the heart of the house was still miles away, sitting in a small apartment in a neighborhood he had never bothered to visit. He closed his eyes, the silence of the mansion finally becoming unbearable. He didn't need an advisor anymore. He needed a map. The neighborhood was a labyrinth of cracked asphalt and leaning tenements, a world away from the manicured lawns and silent fortresses of the estate. Hong Min sat in the back of his black sedan, watching the rain smear the neon lights of a nearby corner store. He had lived his entire life in rooms designed to intimidate, but as he stepped out onto the damp pavement, he felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest. He was no longer the king of the West Wing. He was a man in a $3,000 suit, standing in front of a building that smelled of old brick and cooking spices. The stairwell was narrow, the walls peeling with layers of paint that looked like ancient shed skin. Hong Min climbed the 3 flights slowly, his polished shoes clicking on the uneven wood. He reached apartment 4B and stopped. For a man who had ordered hits and negotiated with cartels, the simple act of raising his hand to knock felt like lifting a mountain. He looked at his tattooed knuckles, the dragons that usually signaled his lethality, and felt they were nothing more than ink and vanity. When the door finally opened, Chi stood there in a faded sweatshirt, her eyes red-rimmed and tired. The small apartment behind her was cramped, filled with the scent of ginger and the soft hum of a radiator, but it was warm, a warmth the mansion had never achieved. "Mr. Hong Min," she whispered, her voice devoid of the fear he usually commanded. She didn't bow, she didn't move aside. She stood her ground in the doorway of her sanctuary. "If you've come to threaten me again, I have nothing left for you to take." Hong Min looked at her, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't know where to put his hands. He felt oversized and grotesque in the small hallway. "I didn't come to threaten you," he said, his voice gravelly and stripped of its habitual steel. "I came because Hayun spoke." Chi-Chi's expression shattered, the hardness in her eyes melting into a desperate, hopeful light. "She spoke? What did she say?" "She said your name," Hong Min replied, his gaze dropping to the floor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather-bound notebook he had found in the nursery. He held it out like a peace offering, his fingers trembling slightly. "I found this. I read what you wrote about the marigolds, about the hummingbird glitch, about me." Chi-Chi took the notebook, her fingers brushing against his. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and she didn't see the Mafia boss or the mountain. She saw a man drowning in a sea of his own making. "I was wrong," Hong Min said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. He forced himself to look up, to meet her eyes with a raw, unshielded honesty. "I saw a threat where there was only love. I listened to a man who spoke the language of greed because I had forgotten any other tongue. My house, it's a tomb, Chi-Chi. My children are fading, and I don't know how to reach them." He did something then that would have ended his reign if his subordinates had seen it. He bowed. Not the shallow, formal bow of a businessman, but a deep, agonizing surrender of his pride. "I am not asking you to come back as a maid. I am asking you to come back as a teacher. Teach them how to laugh again, and please, teach me how to be their father." The silence in the hallway was long, punctuated only by the distant sound of a siren on the street below. Hong Min waited, powerless for the first time in his life, realizing that his millions, his soldiers, and his ink meant nothing. His entire world was balanced on the breath of the woman standing in front of him. Chi-Chi looked down at the notebook, then back at the man who had broken her heart only days before. She saw the dragon on his neck, but she also saw the father who had traveled into the dark just to find a way back to his children. She stepped back, opening the door just wide enough for him to enter. "The first lesson, Mr. Hong Min," she said softly, "is that you have to leave the suit at the door. Mountains don't play. Fathers do." The following month, the iron gates of the estate were no longer a barrier designed to keep the world out. They stood wide open, a symbol of a fortress that had finally breathed. Inside, the perfect order that Hong Min had once prized above all else had been replaced by something chaotic, vibrant, and deeply alive. The marble floors of the foyer, once polished to a mirror shine, were now crisscrossed with colorful tape tracks for Se-Yun's toy cars, and the suffocating scent of lemon wax had been permanently evicted by the smell of baking bread and the faint, sweet aroma of marigold flowers. Hong Min moved through the West Wing, but he didn't move with the predatory silence of a mafia boss. He wore an old, oversized cotton t-shirt and loose trousers, his feet bare against the cool stone. He found the nursery door, which was no longer locked or even latched. It was wide open, and the sound pouring out of it was a symphony of glitches. The room was a glorious Technicolor disaster. Blankets were draped over the hand-carved mahogany chairs to form a sprawling mountain range of forts. Sheets of paper covered in vibrant finger paintings were taped to the walls, hiding the expensive, somber wallpaper. In the center of the room, Chi-Chi sat on the floor, her laughter harmonizing with a high-pitched, melodic babble that made Hong Min stop in his tracks every time he heard it. Hyun was standing, not stiffly, but with a swaying, rhythmic grace, holding a set of colorful scarves. She wasn't silent, she was narrating her own glitch dance in a series of half-formed words and joyful chirps that were more beautiful to Hong Min than any opera he had ever attended. Se-Yun was right beside her, wearing a cardboard crown and a cape made of a kitchen towel, roaring with a confidence that had once been buried under layers of fear. "Look, Appa, the robot is glitching," Se-Yun shouted, pointing at his father. Hong Min didn't freeze. He didn't look at his watch. Instead, he dropped to his knees on the rug, his tattooed arms reaching out to scoop both children into a messy, sprawling embrace. He let them pull at his hair and climb on his shoulders, the dragons on his skin no longer symbols of a terrifying empire, but merely the backdrop for a game of mountain climb. Chi-Chi watched from the corner, a soft, knowing smile on her face. She saw the man who had once been a mountain of obsidian, now rolling on the carpet, his deep, resonant laughter filling the gaps between the children's shrieks. He had learned that a kingdom isn't built on silence and fear, but on the courage to be loud, to be messy, and to be broken. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in the marigold orange Chi-Chi had described in her notebook, Hong Min stood on the balcony with his children. He wasn't looking out for enemies. He was showing Hyun how to whistle. The business of the crime syndicate still existed, but it was now a distant echo, managed by men who knew that their boss was no longer interested in the cold mechanics of power. Hong Min had discovered a new kind of authority, the kind that comes from being the person your children run toward rather than the one they hide from. He looked at Chi-Chi, who stood by the door, and then at his daughter, who was currently trying to glitch the sunset by waving a purple scarf at it. He realized that the greatest truth he had ever discovered wasn't found in a security feed or a financial ledger. It was found in the chaos of a home that had finally learned to speak. The new kingdom was messy, it was loud, and it was imperfect. But as Hong Min felt Hyun's small, warm hand slip into his own, he knew it was the only empire worth ruling. Hey family, thank you for the constant love and support on this channel. Every like, share, comment, and subscription truly means everything to me and helps this community keep growing. If you're enjoying these stories, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Also, drop your name and where you're watching from in the comments. I'll be giving personal shoutouts and thanking you directly in my next post. I appreciate every single one of you.